Methodism has a history that goes back to England, and then when coming across the big ocean to the United States and to the Caribbean and to South America, back over to the continent of Africa and Asia. Part of the history is right here in Mount Vernon. So we're going to explore some of the high points, the highlights of Methodism here in Mount Vernon through First United Methodist Church. It's not an exhaustive presentation. We will not talk about some of the divisions, or I won't say divisions, but sections of Methodism. We're not going to talk about AME Zion. We're not going to talk about AME. We're not going to talk about CME today. We're talking about the trunk line of Methodist Episcopal from which we descend. And I hope that it's a presentation that's informative for everyone. It's the first big one we've had in a long time, and we hope that in 2023 we'll have another presentation which will talk about some other areas of Methodism here in Mount Vernon. First, we'd like to acknowledge some of the individuals who have contributed to this presentation this afternoon. The Committee on Church History and Records has worked diligently to uncover a lot of the history of First Church here in Mount Vernon. So we'd like to acknowledge the committee members, Mr. Marcus Griffith, Ms. Loretta Hottinger, Mr. Jonathan Maxwell, Mr. Gerald Lane, Ms. Monica McCallum, Reverend Tisha Branch, Kim Wilson Owens, who's been acting ex officio, and myself. Thank you. The committee would also like to thank those individuals who have been instrumental in this particular presentation. And so we want to first acknowledge Dr. Larry Spruill, who is the city historian. He's an historian on Mount Vernon, African American history in Westchester County. He is a professor emeritus from Morehouse. He was at one time principal of Mount Vernon High School. He's an artist, photographer, a writer, a scholar, and a friend of mine. So he's given us a lot of information and basis for things, and we hope that as we go forward, we'll continue to work with him as we uncover the history of Mount Vernon. We'd also like to acknowledge and thank Ms. Marilyn Fisher, who was instrumental in getting the posters lined up for us there, and what a wonderful presentation she got together for us. We want to acknowledge Ms. Keisha Chisholm for her technical support. We have some very interesting charts later on in the presentation which kind of illustrate some of our history. And then last but not least, we'd like to thank Dr. Dion Finley, Brother Ron Mitchell, Brother Houston Watson, and the media team for helping us to get this presentation together today. And last but not least, we have to thank our Reverend Keisha Branch for her spiritual support and guidance in all that we do and say here at First United Methodist Church. We're going to start out with I don't want to yell at this. We want to start out with a timeline of Methodism here in Mount Vernon. Methodism started here in this area in 1835. It was started in the Eastchester Methodist Episcopal Church, which was organized in what was then the town of Eastchester. 1852, First United Methodist Church organized a group of followers, started meeting at the home. Doesn't that sound common? Isn't that a common thread, that a group of followers would get together for prayer and study, and then they would decide we'd like to build further and form a church. And so they came to the pastor of Eastchester Church and told them that they would like to form a church in Mount Vernon, and the Reverend Divine helped them to organize in Mount Vernon. In 1887, Grace Methodist Episcopal Church was organized. A group of followers got together in that area of Mount Vernon at that time and decided that they wanted to form a church closer to where they lived. You know, back in the 1880s, there were no trains, there were no buses, there were no cars. You went by buggy or you walked. And so it was easier if you could go to your church on a regular basis in walking distance. And we think about our Jewish brethren, where they move to some place where they're in walking distance of a synagogue. Maybe not so much now, but certainly when I was growing up, the Jewish people did that. And so it wasn't very different for us that we did the same thing. In 1891, a group of Swedish people decided that they wanted to form a Methodist church in Mount Vernon. They organized and they worshiped in what was the German Methodist Episcopal Church in Mount Vernon. They're not listed here because we don't know a whole lot about the German Methodist Episcopal Church, but they worshiped in the same building. We do know that the German church dates back to 1864. So it was actually the second church, Methodist church, formed in Mount Vernon. In 1891, the same year that the Swedish Methodist Church organized, First Church decided that they wanted to expand their ministry to the north side of Mount Vernon. The original First Church building is located on the south side. It's located at 8th Avenue and 2nd Street. The building is still there, and we'll show some slides of the building back in 1882 and now in 2022. The North Methodist Episcopal Church was formed kind of independent of First Church in that they had their own preacher, they had their own minister. They didn't last very long. They found that they weren't able to deliver services to the population that they desired, and they disbanded. And most of the original members returned to First Church. In 1897, Chester Hill Methodist Episcopal Church organized. This is the building of Chester Hill Methodist Church that we're in right now. They organized, and this is a great distance, walking, riding, taking a buggy from where First Church was. So they said, we're developing up here in the northeast section. We'd like to have a church here. And they came to the pastor of First Church to say we'd like to organize. So there are two churches that organized out of First Church. Grace Church, which is now located in the Bronx, and Chester Hill. In 1900, the North Methodist Episcopal Church disbanded. For the reasons that I mentioned, they just didn't feel that they were servicing the community that they intended. In 1954, the Swedish Methodist Church merged with Chester Hill, the church that was here. They had declining membership, and so they merged. And when First Church merged with Chester Hill, there were former members of the Swedish Methodist Church here. Just like the German church spoke German services, the Swedish church spoke Swedish and English services. And I remember one of the former members saying that their parents wanted them not to know just Swedish, but also to speak English as well. In 1967, First Church and Chester Hill Methodist churches merged together. There was declining membership and rather dramatic membership decline between 1950 and 1965. And so there was a study that was commissioned, and it documented the changes and recommended, actually said that it wasn't sustainable to have those two congregations separate. In 1968, First Church became First United Methodist Church, as we are today. beginnings of Methodism start with John and Charles Wesley, brothers born in England. John was actually an Anglican priest and a scholar. Charles was a musician, lyricist, and as noted in one of the presentations upstairs, they made a great team. John was a preacher, Charles was a musician, and there are over 9,000 hymns that are attributed to Charles Wesley, many of which we still sing today. Methodism spread over to the Americas, and so John Wesley sent Francis Asbury to the United States to start to spread the word here. Francis was not the most articulate of speakers, but he was able to garner the interest of people in the countryside because the United States was all rural then. And he was a circuit rider. He got on his horse and rode from town to town. Didn't stay very long, but he preached the gospel to those who would listen. Shortly after Francis Asbury came to the Americas, Thomas Coke came to the Americas, was sent by John Wesley to ordain Francis Asbury as a bishop. So Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke were the first two bishops, Methodist bishops, here in the United States. Francis was known for traveling up and down the East Coast. Thomas ventured outside of the United States. He ventured into the West Indies, he ventured up to Canada, he ventured into Sierra Leone, and he actually died on a trip to spread Methodism into India. He died on the ship. But these were two of the founding bishops in the Methodist Church here in the United States. Methodism roots in Westchester go back to the Eastchester Methodist Episcopal Church. If anybody knows something about Mount Vernon, there's a historic St. Paul's Church, Episcopal Church down on Columbus Avenue, just before you go into the Bronx. That church dates back into the 1600s. And so there was a group of residents who were congregants of that church. In 1771, Francis Asbury came to the Americas and started to pass through this area of the country. And he made several trips riding his horse up and down the East Coast. He visited the St. Paul's Episcopal Church many times. People around that area were inspired by his preaching, by his teaching, and decided that they wanted to form a Methodist church in the town of Eastchester. Eastchester was separate from Mount Vernon. Actually, Mount Vernon didn't exist in 1835. The Eastchester Methodist Church later became the Asbury Methodist Church. Asbury exists today in a different location than it did back in 1853, actually 1835. But the congregation still existed as one of the longest standing Methodist congregations in this area. And this is a picture of Asbury today. Interesting side story about Eastchester Methodist Church. Although they were the founding church, they were the mother church for First Church. When First Church built their second building in 1886, members of Eastchester Church flocked to the new church building. It was larger, it was more comfortable, and they had cushions on the benches. What's of historic note, and this was brought to my attention by Dr. Sproul, was that one of the founding members of Eastchester Church was a former slave, Rebecca Turner. Not just a founder in terms of being there, but she contributed money, because by 1835, I think she was a tavern owner down in that area of what is now Mount Vernon. So she's listed as a supporter. The church used to, in their annual celebrations, raise her name as a patron mother of the church. And that's an interesting note that Dr. Sproul has uncovered and made sure that others like myself spread the word about her. In 1886, when First Church opened their new building, and I said that people flocked to the new building, it caused the closing of Eastchester Church. And so for 3 or 4 years, the church was closed. During that time, Sarah Lizzie Nelson, who was the granddaughter of Rebecca Turner, continued to have Sunday school in her house and the houses of members or former members. In the 1890s, she went to the district superintendent of the area and said, look, we need to be open. We have money. You've got to reopen us. And so she is responsible for the reopening of Eastchester Church, a Methodist church at that time. It wasn't until the late 1890s that the name changed from Eastchester to Asbury, as it is right now. And at that time, Asbury, that area of Eastchester, became part of Mount Vernon. So, depending on who you speak to, First Church may not have been the first Methodist church in Mount Vernon. Geographically it was, because it was within the boundaries of Mount Vernon, but the first Methodist church in the area and the founding church was Eastchester. In 1852, the church family organized. In 1854, they became formally chartered with the county of Westchester. In 1853, they started talking about building a church. And they realized that they hadn't gone through the proper steps to incorporate. So in 1854, they did so. In 1856, the new church, the first church building, was erected, and the church grew rapidly in Mount Vernon, as Mount Vernon grew rapidly. Mount Vernon grew from the west, from the Bronx line, eastward this way. And so many of the churches in Mount Vernon were located on adjoining streets in the west Mount Vernon. If you look at some old maps, you'll see that there may have been 2 or 3 churches on the same block. There may have been a synagogue and a Lutheran church, a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church. They were all kind of clustered because people of faith wanted a place to practice their religion. In 1922, there was a celebration. That was the 50-year celebration of First Church. And this is a photograph of First Church at that time. I'm sorry, the light is coming through the stained glass there. The original First Church building is located at 8th Avenue and 2nd Street. This is a photo of it today. It's still there. It's still used as a church. The Bible Way Church uses it. They bought it from First Church in the early 1970s after the merger, and we'll talk about what happened with the merger. And of course, this is a photo of First United Methodist Church this week. So a little synopsis. First Methodist Episcopal Church organized in 1852. In 1854, it incorporated formally. In 1856, the first church building was dedicated. And in 1886, a new church was dedicated in October of 1886. One of the outstanding personalities in First Church history was the Reverend Arthur Bartholow, the Reverend Dr. Arthur Bartholow. He was a pastor of First Methodist Episcopal Church from 1905 to 1942. That's a span of 37 years. It's pretty much unheard of. If you go through the list of pastors at First Church before him and after him, at Chester Hill here, at Wakefield Grace, pastors were around for 1 or 2 years and then they were reassigned because they were circuit riders and that was part of your appointment as a Methodist preacher, Methodist minister. You agreed that you would be assigned whenever and wherever. But somehow Reverend Bartholomew stayed here for 37 years. He was a great congregation builder. That's a term that we could use. He was an inspirational speaker. He was an organizer and able to get things done. During his pastorate at First Church, the congregation grew from just under 1,000 to 2,000 members, active members. He established the Buffalo Men's Bible Class, and he was a founding member of the National Men's Bible Movement, which still exists today. He enlisted more than 1,200 members at the height of the Buffalo class. The Buffalo class was divided into divisions: the red division, the white division, and the blue division. Red, white, and blue. And each division was responsible for their members. If someone fell upon hard times, the division took care of them. If someone was sick, the division took care of them. Particularly, this was important in the 1930s when the Depression came and people were on hard times. There was no social services to help you out. You went to your family, your friends, and your church. And the Buffalo Bible class was there to provide that support. A new parish house was commissioned and built in 1923, and that was so that activities could be held outside the church building proper. The War Memorial Building was built, and it housed the Methodist Men's Group and a lot of activities that took place in Mount Vernon. It still exists today. The building was sold to Macedonia Baptist Church, which is a block and a half away. It had, I haven't been in there in a few years, but it had a huge auditorium, gymnasium area, twice the size of what we have here today, downstairs. They had bowling alleys downstairs. It was about 4 lanes, and of course you had to set them up. They had a huge banquet hall downstairs. The auditorium upstairs, they held banquets in as well. There were full kitchens in the first floor and in the basement. And lots of affairs were done, fundraising and socializing were done at the Memorial Building. So this is the First Church War Memorial Building, and this is taken around 1952. And this is the First Church Bartholomew Memorial Building, which is now Macedonia Center in 2022 this week. These buildings were built to last. Okay, I just want to make that little side comment. We mentioned that Wakefield Grace, or Grace as it was named initially, was organized in 1887. The building was donated by First Church. What they did, as First Church completed their building in 1886, they disassembled the original church building and gave it to the congregation that was growing at Grace Church. And at that time, Grace Church was in the boundaries of Mount Vernon. It was not part of the Bronx yet. It was named Washingtonville Methodist Episcopal Church because that was the Washingtonville section of Mount Vernon. The building was dedicated in 1888, and it was renamed Grace Methodist Episcopal Church of Mount Vernon in 1890. Sister Joy, do you know when it was named Wakefield Grace? We're gonna dig deeper into that as we look into our sister congregations and reveal the histories of all of us. And here's a photo of Grace Methodist Episcopal Church when it first opened, which is the same as the photo for First Church when it opened. And this is a photo of Wakefield Grace United Methodist Church this week, 2022. A little aside, Grace Church is about to embark upon a major renovation of their building. of their building and rejuvenation of their ministry in the Bronx there, and we look forward to assisting with that renovation. North Methodist Church, as I mentioned, was established, organized by First Church as a missionary congregation on North Fifth Avenue. If anybody knows Mount Vernon, it was located where the ICA building was located. Well, the building's still there, but there's nobody in the building. Does anybody know where the Armory is in Mount Vernon? Okay, it's the corner of North Avenue and North Fifth Avenue. And that's where the church was organized. And again, it didn't last too long. And the church, after building the church, they sold it and abandoned it. Not sure exactly when it was disbanded as a church, but around 1900, I stopped seeing their names listed in the Mount Vernon directory. Okay. Along comes Chester Hill Methodist Church. Chester Hill was a mission church, although they organized up here in the northeast corner of Mount Vernon. They did come to the pastor of First Church and say, we would like to organize as a church. A little aside that's not on the slide, when they wanted to build the church building, there was a woman in the community, that's how she's described in the Daily Argus back in 1900, who didn't feel that a church was appropriate for this growing society here. And she petitioned the city, and it was a battle that was raised in the newspapers about whether a church building should go up in her neighborhood. But it happened. In 1898, the church was organized, and in 1901, the first sermon was preached here at Chester Hill. Of interesting note, with Chester Hill, the Bishop Herbert Welch was a minister here at Chester Hill. He was a minister here from 1903 through 1905. He left here and became the president of Ohio Wesleyan University from 1905 to 1916, and then he went on to become a bishop. He was a bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church for 20 years, active, and he remained as a bishop until his death at 106 years old. So 53 years he served as a bishop. That's a lifetime for anybody. He was the originator and first executive from 1940 to 1948 of what today is known as the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR. For those who don't know, UMCOR is an organization that goes to areas where disasters occur. Not just in the United States, but outside the United States. They're there before other relief teams get there. There's a storehouse in Pennsylvania, and they keep it stocked year-round, so that if a disaster comes, they can send out volunteers, they have supplies, and it's a wonderful organization that many people don't know anything about. Our church benevolence funds and dues go to supporting this effort. When there's a hurricane that comes through in Texas or comes through in Belize, UMCOR is there. I mentioned about the Swedish Methodist Church in Mount Vernon, and I don't have a lot of history about them. As we go through the records here, I'm sure we'll uncover some of their records here in the church. But this is a photo, and you can't see it, I'm sorry, of the Methodist Church, which was built in 1898. And this is a picture of the church today. It was bought by the Evangelical Church, but it still exists. Other Methodist churches that are now defunct are the German Methodist Church, and we'll find out more about them. They probably disbanded around 1819, 1820. Again, it's because I don't see them listed in the city directory anymore. And then the Swedish Methodist Church had a number of names. It was called Zion Swedish, Morrison Place Swedish. It depended on what directory you looked in. This is a busy slide, but it kind of shows the growth of Methodism in Mount Vernon and the decline in terms of churches in Mount Vernon. So we start out 1835, and you can't see it, with Eastchester, and then by 1852, there was Eastchester and First Church. And then there was a rapid growth of Methodist churches from 1852 to 1901. So that's when we see the German Methodist Church come in, the North Methodist Division come in, we see Grace come in, we see the Swedish Methodist Church, and we see Chester Hill. So there are quite a few Methodist churches in this small space of 4.4 square miles. In 1925 to 1950, we saw a decline in the number of churches that were in Mount Vernon. We were left with Asbury, First Church, the Swedish Church, and Chester Hill. And then by 1968, after the merger of First Church and Chester Hill, Asbury remained and First Church remains. This is another slide that just kind of is graphic about the memberships that led to the merger of First Church and Chester Hill. In 1950, First Church stated that they had a membership of over 2,000 members. And they had another 1,000 members in their Sunday school. By 1960, that had been cut in half, from 2,000 down to 900. And then in another 4 years, it had dropped from 900 to 600. A similar trend was going on with Chester Hill here, and not as dramatic with Asbury because it was a very small congregation to begin with. They continued to have a large Sunday school at Asbury, even though the congregation went down. We can lay claim to some important figures in Mount Vernon politics. From 1892 to 1921, 4 of the mayors, matter of fact, all the mayors in Mount Vernon were either members of First Church or members of the Bartholomew class. They served a term, then they got off because they got defeated by somebody else in their church. And a few years later, they came back, and then someone from the Bartholomew class ran, and but it was that large family of First Church and the Bartholomew class that were the political heads in Mount Vernon. And then in 1939 to 1951, which was 12 years, one of the mayors was from here at Chester Hill. So we've been involved in the political life of Mount Vernon for a long time. Okay, and we would be remiss not to mention some of our own current members who have been involved with city government. There's a picture here of Marcus A. Griffith, who was city council person from 2008 to 2009 when he filled the spot that was vacated by one of the council persons at that time. And then he had his own term from 2014 to 2021. Sister Loretta Hottinger was city council person from 2000 to 2009. And then she took on the job of being corporate counsel, the legal arm for the city of Mount Vernon. We just wanted to highlight some of the ministers here in the last 50 years at First Methodist Church, at First United Methodist Church. From 1975 to 2004, our pastor was the Reverend Louis E. Rowley. He served here for 29 years. That's the second longest tenure for ministers at First Methodist Church anyway. And he left because of retirement. He'd have kept going if it wasn't mandatory. Right? And some people in the room knew Reverend Rowley and what he brought to our congregation. Before he came, there was no food pantry. It was started under his ministry. The big renovation project that we had started in 1997. It was under his pastorate and his guidance that we embarked upon that rebuilding, rejuvenation of our church building, which allowed us to expand our ministries. We had a roof that leaked, like many churches, and that was the first thing that we attacked. The next thing that we worked on was the Diefendorf gym downstairs. You say, why was that important? Because while the sanctuary was getting renovated, we had a place to worship. Okay. And it had new microphone systems at that time. The heating system worked very well because it was brand new at that time. Right. And then the sanctuary was done over. We had carpeting in there before the renovation, and you see the floor now. The glass along the back where the media team works, that was covered over with some type of wood. And we exposed that so that beautiful glass came through. The ceiling light in the middle where the light is, okay, that was covered up. And so that was uncovered so light could come through and bless us on a sunny Sunday morning. Also the windows, the stained glass windows on the Summit side and the Lincoln side, on the outside were covered with plastic. I understand that it was done for weatherization purposes, but we uncovered it, and I don't think that we got any colder from that. But it restored the beauty of the building. During that time, between 1997 and 2004, we raised $500,000, $500,000. And it wasn't enough, but it was enough to get us going. When we first embarked upon it, Sister Loretta and I were co-chairpersons of the committee, and we talked about, well, how much money do we think we want to raise? And Sister Loretta and I said, well, we can't do anything with less than $100,000. Reverend Rowley kind of shook his head, $100,000? How are we going to do that? And we said, through hard work and faith. So over the next 6 years, we raised $500,000, over $500,000, exceeded our goal. Reverend Rowley retired in 2004, and in 2004, Reverend Dolores Henderson came to us. She was here for a relatively short period of time. She came just at the end of her active ministry. And so at the age of 70, she was required to retire, and so she left us in 2006. But she continued to serve at a number of other churches as she was called to after she retired from us. In 2006, one thing that I can highlight with Reverend Henderson, I know from personal testimonies that she inspired a few of the members to get more active in the church activities. So there were at least 2 people who acknowledged that because of her, they became lay speakers. In 2006, the Reverend Herman Darden came to us. We were experiencing some problems, some difficulties with our finances at that time. And one thing that was positive with Reverend Darden was that he set us straight on how the committees functioned with the United Methodist Church. Prior to his ministry, only select few knew exactly what the committees were supposed to be doing. And with Reverend Darden on board, he said everybody needs to know everything. So he served with us to 2011. In 2011, Reverend Chin came to us with a different type of energy, a different vision for our church. And as we came to know Reverend Chin, he was a congregation builder and still is today. He was the type of pastor who gets sent to congregations where they may be struggling, and he's able to set them up right and get them going forward. And he's moved on then, okay? So when Reverend Chin left us, many of us were disappointed. Why didn't they leave him here? We were doing so well. Well, he was called to a different aspect of the ministry, and that was to help some other churches move along and move on up. And he's doing that today. He's pastoring 2 churches in the Bronx that need his guidance. Under Reverend Chin, more members became involved with United Methodist Church on the district level and on the conference level. So we had an increase in the number of lay speakers, lay servants that got certified. We had increased participation on the district level with United Methodist Women and with involvement with the Committee on Pastors' Salaries and Benefits. Those were things that we really weren't active with prior to Reverend Chin, and this was a couple of things that we want to highlight. And now we move on to 2020 with our own Reverend Tisha Branch. Reverend Branch came to us at a very turbulent time in the history of our church, in the history of our country, in the history of our world. Who would have ever thought that we would have a pandemic, not an epidemic, but a pandemic that affected everybody on this planet? And so Reverend Branch has been able to keep us floating. And now that things seem to be getting a little better, we're starting to get above water. We're not treading in any water anymore. We're going to try to walk on water.
Amen.
So we thank Reverend Branch for her ministry to this point, and we look forward to greater and bigger things.
Amen. Amen.
First United Methodist Church over the years has been the church home not only to congregations of other Methodists, but other denominations outside of Methodism. It's opened its doors and facilities to many community groups and many functions. And we want to list the food pantry, which originated here. Now we serve close to 100 people every other week. When we started out, it was maybe 6 to 7 under Reverend Rowley. And it's continued to grow through the hard work of the lay people, the lay ministers of our church. A tutoring program for elementary children had existed here for 20 years, but it's probably 25 years. It was a Saturday morning program. It was free, and it was staffed by teachers from the Mount Vernon School District. Various gym activities have been housed here in our building. There was a dance class, a tap class, that used to function in the gymnasium. We now have the Mount Vernon Junior Knights basketball program that makes First Church their home. What we can pat ourselves on the back is that we house a facility which helps young men and young women to grow with responsibility. So when they leave the program here, they're ready to go to high school levels, not just in Mount Vernon, but they go to Stepinac, they go to Mount St. Michael, they go to Iona, and they participate at a high level at these other high schools. And certainly people are familiar with the history of Mount Vernon basketball and how people have gone from Mount Vernon to do very well in college and even some to play in the professional ranks. As I mentioned, a couple of other churches have housed their worship and Bible studies here. The Bible Way Church of Christ, the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church was here until they were able to purchase a building on 3rd Avenue. And our current congregation that shares our facility is the Christ International Center. They've been with us for over 30 years. They own this building as much as we do. They used to come here, and after worship, they would have feast, roasting pigs and carrying on after a Sunday service. Oh yeah, on a regular basis. We haven't seen them so much during the pandemic, but they've taken ownership of this building, and they've been great partners in moving forward. They've had a lot of craftsmen as part of their congregations, and each year they made a donation to our church. They redid the kitchen, they redid the Diefendorf room downstairs, the floors and the lighting were all redone by workmen from the congregation of Christ International Church. and we're certainly indebted to their partnership with us in Christ. Who said what? Thank you, Sister Kim. That's why I pay you the big bucks. YCOP has become a part of our church family here in a number of ways. They've run their program from here, and Brother Henry can tell me exactly how many years. Is it 15 years you've been in here, Brother Henry? I know you hear me up there.
2011, she said.
2011, okay. So we're talking about 11 years, okay, going on 15. And so it provides lots of services and opportunities to Mount Vernon youth that aren't available with other organizations. As Brother Henry pointed out many times, some of the programs in Mount Vernon, Monday through Friday, nothing on Saturday, definitely nothing on Sunday and on holidays. Brother Henry lives here. When he's not home, this is where you can find him. He's dedicated to the program, and they continue to expand in terms of their services to the Mount Vernon and neighboring communities. And Brother Henry and Sister Monique are members of our church. Amen. Now, First United Methodist Church has many ministries for members, families, and friends. Some of the opportunities are the Tuesday night prayer and praising in the evening. There's Wednesday morning prayer and meditation. There's Wednesday evening prayer and Bible study, which is led by the pastor. We have Sunday morning church school. We have a young adult ministry, which is growing. A youth and adolescent ministry, which is about to jump off the ground again with a new youth minister that we've employed. There's the midweek Phoebe Joy, and that stands for Just Older Youth Ministry, which continues to do good things in 2020. There's the United Women of Faith, which was formerly known as United Methodist Women, and they have a long history in our church and in the United Methodist Church. There's the media ministry, there's the music ministry, and there's the food pantry outreach ministry. What you don't see on there, and we're working on for 2023, is the United Methodist Men. Since mid-2020, our sanctuary came into the 21st century with the addition of audiovisual and multimedia aids of microphone and speaker upgrades, installation of mounted cameras and monitors. Services and activities are streamed on Zoom and Facebook. Recorded services are viewed on YouTube and the church website. Prior to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, worship services had expanded the music ministry with several choirs, praise dancing, and enhanced laity participation. The ladies' parlor upstairs was updated to a multi-purpose conference room. The food pantry ministry now services close to 100 families twice monthly. The current United Methodist Church building is a part of the National Registry of Historic Sites. Pastor was talking, yes. Oh, a top of the line organ. And I left that out, and that we'll highlight that at another date. But it's a historic organ. It was built in the 1930s, and it's a Heisers and Hammond line. I can't remember exactly the name, but there aren't that many around. And when you go to the registry, you'll see that there are only a couple in New York City with all the churches that are there. So we're very fortunate to have it here, but over the past 10 years, we've needed to update it. It was a pipe organ. You don't see pipe organs around, maybe Carnegie Hall, but you don't see them in many churches because there's a lot of upkeep that's needed, and it's expensive. There's only a few companies that really know how to do it well. So over the years, we've been able to modify it. And it's a hybrid system that we now have. It's computerized. You can put disc in there, you can program it. We can have it playing with nobody in there. Okay? And we want to thank the media team, and it was initiated with Brother Ron Mitchell that we needed to upgrade it rather than to continue to sink money into repairs. But the basic organ is still there, and when we have individuals that come in and play at our organ, they're in love with the organ that we have. It's one of the better ones, they say, that they've had the opportunity to play on. Where is First Church going 2020 into the next 10, 50, 170 years? We don't know, but right now, assembling here, we're making history by being here. What we did yesterday is making history, and what we do tomorrow will make history. So it behooves us to be conscious and cognizant of what we're doing as a church family to try to lift up the name of Jesus Christ in the community, in First Church and the community. We want to pray for the next 170 years of First United Methodist Church and the next 170 years of Methodism in Mount Vernon. At a later talk, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about our sister churches and how we interconnect or need to interconnect better. So I want to thank everybody for their attention this afternoon. And as always, to God be the glory.